We come to the subject of tonight's presentation, our 16th president, a man adored north of the Mason-Dixon line and still hated by many south of it, Abraham Lincoln. Now, this year marks the 150th anniversary of both the Civil War, the end of the Civil War, and the death of Lincoln. And most history books, including almost all the ones from the schools we attended, essentially summarize the legacy of Lincoln in 6 words: preserved the Union, freed the slaves. Now, this evening, we will present for your consideration a man who is perhaps the leading proponent of a very different viewpoint. Dr. Thomas DiLorenzo is professor of economics at Loyola University, Maryland, and a senior fellow of the Ludwig von Mises Institute. He holds a PhD in economics from Virginia Tech. He's the author of dozens of academic journal articles, and he's also a prolific author, authoring or co-authoring, I get tired just looking at the numbers, 14 books, including Lincoln Unmasked and The Real Lincoln.
I wanted to introduce my talk by piquing your curiosity and making me maybe get you to ask the question, well, why did people hate Lincoln so much? So many prominent people. These are not Southerners that are documented in this book. These are newspaper editors and politicians and people that from New York, Wisconsin, in northern states. Well, if you ever read his first inaugural address, which very few Americans seem to have ever read. There are many books written about the second inaugural address, in which Lincoln blames the war on God. And he said the war came, and it was God's punishment of Americans. He said, God never chose to punish the British, though, or the Spaniards, or the French, or the Danes, or the Dutch, apparently. It's just us for slavery. But the first inaugural address, if you read it, I call it the strongest defense of slavery ever made by an American politician, because it was made by the President of the United States. It wasn't just some mere member of Congress or a Southern plantation owner or someone like that, but it was Lincoln. He said this in the first inaugural: "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." And then the Congress issued a war aims resolution at the time that said this: that this war is not waged upon our part in any spirit of oppression, nor for any purpose of conquest or subjugation, nor for purpose of overthrowing or interfering with the rights or institutions of the states, by which they meant slavery, the institutions of the states, but to defend and maintain the supremacy of the Constitution and to preserve the Union. So the president said the purpose of the war is not to do anything about slavery. The Congress issued a proclamation, a war aims proclamation, and Lincoln wrote this famous letter in 1862 to Horace Greeley. He was a newspaper editor of the New York Tribune, where he said that his purpose in the war is not to end slavery or do anything about slavery. He said his purpose was to save the Union, and he said if I could do that without freeing any slaves, I would do it. If I could do it with freeing some and leaving others in bondage, I would also do that. And so it's very clear, if you look at Lincoln's own words in the first inaugural address and elsewhere, that the war wasn't about slavery. And now, so regardless of whatever reasons the southern states gave for seceding, the war, when Lincoln launched an invasion of the southern states, it was to save the Union. That was what the Congress said was the purpose of the war. They announced to the entire world that's what the war is about. Lincoln did the same thing. And in the same speech, Lincoln defended the Fugitive Slave Act very vigorously. And this was a federal law passed in 1850 that put a federal bounty on runaway slaves, and it forced Northerners basically to round up runaway slaves, and they were paid, I think it was $10 if they decided, the magistrates were paid $10 if they decided to send the slave back to his or her owner, and $5 if they decided against that. And you don't have to have a PhD in economics like me to understand the incentive effect of that sort of thing. And Lincoln very strongly supported the Fugitive Slave Act, although some of the northern states had nullified it. They just didn't pay attention to it. Some of the northern states That was their way of trying to battle slavery peacefully, by not so that if a slave escaped into one of these states, there would be no prosecution or rounding up of those people. So Lincoln, and actually Lincoln, early in his administration, he instructed William Seward, his Secretary of State, even before he was inaugurated, to do what he could in the Senate to try to get a federal law that would have superseded these state nullification laws, because he knew that he thought that this was going to break up the Union sooner rather than later if northern states began nullifying the Fugitive Slave Act. And so he wanted a federal law that would have prohibited these northern states from allowing escaped slaves to remain escaped and be free people. And then another thing that very few people know about from Lincoln's first inaugural address was something called the Corwin Amendment. And in the latter part of Lincoln's first inaugural address, he refers to this amendment to the Constitution that was named after a congressman, Corwin. And what the amendment said was that basically that the federal government could never have anything to do with the ending of Southern slavery. It made it impossible for the federal government to end Southern slavery, and so that it would have enshrined slavery explicitly in the Constitution, and which it never was explicitly in the Constitution. It was defended by the Supreme Court in the famous Dred Scott decision for just a few years earlier, but in the Constitution itself, there's no explicit defense. But Lincoln, in the first inaugural address, says, I think slavery is now constitutional, and I have no qualms, and I'm paraphrasing, about making it express and irrevocable. Those are his exact words, express and irrevocable. And I don't usually quote Doris Kearns Goodwin, because I think she's a liar and a plagiarizer, and I'm not just throwing that out. She was kicked off the Pulitzer Prize Committee because of plagiarism, admitted plagiarism. But anyway, she wrote this. She redeemed herself by writing this big fat book about Lincoln, and so that's how the establishment, I guess, redeems themselves from lying and plagiarism, is write a book about Abe Lincoln, and then and be paid a fortune for it. But in that book, and she must have had a large team of researchers, because she did marshal thousands and thousands of footnotes and primary sources and whatnot. And she talks about this Corwin Amendment, and she explains, using all her primary sources, that the origin of this amendment to prohibit the federal government from ever outlawing slavery was Abe Lincoln. He instructed William Seward, this is after he was elected, but before he was inaugurated, to go to the Senate and get support for this amendment, and so which he did. And so this amendment had passed the House and the Senate by the time Lincoln was inaugurated, and 3 states had already passed it also. It had already gone out to the states for ratification. Okay, and so. And Illinois was one of the states. Ohio and Illinois were 2 of the northern states, and Maryland was the 3rd state that had already voted in favor of this Corwin Amendment to explicitly enshrine slavery in the Constitution. So it's Doris Kearns Goodwin, who her book is a big defense of Lincoln, but who she truthfully writes about how this was his idea. He got Seward to get this through the Senate, which he did, and the Senate voted for it. And so if Lincoln had had his way at the time he was inaugurated, slavery would have been protected in the Constitution, explicitly for a long, long time. In that same speech, though, he says, "It is my duty to collect the duties and imposts," and by which he meant tariffs. And at the time, tariffs on imports accounted for more than 90% of all federal tax revenue. There was no income tax. There were a few excise taxes. But the tariff was the main source, literally over 90%. Some years close to 95% in 1858, 59, 1860 federal tax revenues. And the average tariff rate had just been more than doubled 2 days earlier. So President James Buchanan signed the Morrill Tariff, M-O-R-R-I-L-L, Morrill Tariff, 2 days earlier, right? One of the last things he did before leaving office. And it increased the average tax rate or tariff rate from 15% to about 36%. Okay, and so Lincoln says, "It's my duty to collect the duties and imposts." And then the next part of that sentence is, "But beyond that, there will be no invasion of any state." And that's a direct quote. And so he literally threatened an invasion of any state that refused to collect the tariff tax, which had just been doubled, more than doubled, 2 days earlier. And he was fully knowledgeable, of course, of what happened 30 years earlier in South Carolina when the same thing happened. The average tariff rate was pushed up to 45%. And the Southerners at the time sold about 75% of everything they grew, agricultural products, overseas. And so this would have been a big impediment to trade. And so the South Carolinians nullified that tariff. They called it the Tariff of Abominations. And it led to a big confrontation between President Andrew Jackson and the South Carolina politicians. And they eventually compromised. They eventually had a compromised tariff that dropped the 45% tariff down to, eventually it went down to 15% by 1857. So both sides gave in. The historians are kind of dishonest about that. They said this was a great victory for Andrew Jackson, and it proved that the government had the power to tax and whatever it wanted to tax, but that's nonsense. Both Andrew Jackson did not send warships to bomb Charleston Harbor like Lincoln did. He backed down. And so did the South Carolinians. They didn't immediately drop that tariff rate. And if you read about this, it's kind of interesting to read that at one time in our history, the governor of South Carolina was given $160,000 in 1828 for the purpose of purchasing guns to use against tax collectors, federal tax collectors. If they came down there and tried to enforce that tax. And I would imagine you could buy a lot of guns in 1828 with $160,000. And so they were serious. But Lincoln was fully knowledgeable of this, of course. And so he was basically saying, we're going to raise this tax again, because his agenda, his economic agenda, which I've written about in my book, and that's by the way, is how an economist like me, I've always been interested in history, wrote a book about this, because I thought the economic agenda of Lincoln and the Whig Party and then the early Republican Party had been sort of swept under the carpet by historians. And so that's one of the main reasons why I wrote this book as an economist. Anyone can read history. Not anyone can write about economics. You have to know economics to write about it. But we can all read history. We can all read the facts of history and then interpret them, given our own educational backgrounds. And so people at the time, of course, knew this, that Lincoln literally threatened a war over tax collection and then followed through with the threat. The southern states that seceded did not intend to send money to Washington, D.C. And they did, of course, they did not. And another thing that very few Americans seem to know is, I'm still a college professor, and I teach a course in American economic history, and I talk about some of this. And it seems the students that I get, and these are pretty bright students, their parents pay about $50,000 a year of room, board, and tuition, and a lot of them went to good private schools, but almost none of them have ever read the Constitution or know much about the Constitution, other than it allowed slavery to exist or something, anything bad about that area. But even people who study the Constitution sometimes are not too familiar with Article 3, Section 3, which defines what treason is. It says this, and I'm quoting, "Treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them," and that's the key word there, them, "or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort." That's the definition of treason in the U.S. Constitution. And in all the founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitutions, the Articles of Confederation, whenever United States is mentioned, it's always in the plural. It's never in the singular anywhere in the founding documents, which means the states are. It's not something the United States government is. That didn't exist until after the Civil War. It's are. That's why the Article 3, Section 3 says treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them, against the states. So anyone who levies war against, now the states in the Declaration are called the free and independent states. And so ask yourself, when Lincoln launched an invasion of the southern states, well, what was that? Was that treason or not? I say it was a textbook definition of treason, levying war upon the states. And during his administration, though, he took it upon himself to redefine treason as criticism of him and his administration. He illegally suspended the writ of habeas corpus. His own Attorney General, Robert Bates, said it was unconstitutional to do so because only Congress could do that. The section of the Constitution that mentions habeas corpus is under congressional powers, not executive branch powers. And so Congress eventually did get around to it, but Lincoln unilaterally suspended the writ of habeas corpus. And the Chief Justice of the United States at the time was Roger B. Taney, who issued a circuit court opinion that it was unconstitutional. And Supreme Court judges had circuit court duties back in those days. And Lincoln responded by issuing an arrest warrant for Judge Taney. Now, this story first came about by one of Lincoln's own White House lawyers after the war. Ward Layman was his name. And of course, the Republican Party immediately said, he's a drunk. Ward Layman was a drunk. But they always also said Ulysses Grant was a drunk, but he was a great drunk, I guess, great drunk. But Ward Layman, you can't believe him, even though he was Lincoln's confidant and lawyer in the White House. But then several other people, the mayor of Baltimore, who was a friend of Judge Taney, wrote in his memoirs that he knew about this arrest warrant. And then another Supreme Court justice, the justice who wrote the dissenting opinion in the famous Dred Scott case, also in his memoirs, he also said that he knew about the arrest warrant. And so, but apparently they couldn't find a marshal with the guts to go into the chambers of the Chief Justice and drag him into Fort McHenry in prison. And so that happened. I believe that actually happened. But with the suspension of habeas corpus, those denunciations that I read from the New York Times and that Wisconsin newspaper, what a couple of those sentences in those denunciations were alluding to was the mass arrest of tens of thousands of northern citizens by the military with the suspension of habeas corpus. And this included newspaper editors. It included the grandson of Francis Scott Key, who was a newspaper editor in Baltimore, who objected to the suspension of habeas corpus. So he was dragged into a prison in Fort McHenry. There was one of these prisons in the New York Harbor. There was a famous sort of a gulag for political dissenters. And this is all written up. There are scholarly books. James Randall was sort of the preeminent Lincoln scholar of 2 generations ago, really. He taught at the University of Illinois for many years, and his book, Constitutional Problems Under Lincoln, is sort of the old source on this sort of thing, the suspension of habeas corpus. There's another one called Freedom Under Lincoln by Dean Sprague, who writes about the same things. And Dean Sprague said that during the war, the only really free speech there was in the northern states was in these prisons. Because once you're in prison for speaking freely, what have you got to lose? You're already in prison. And so, when I just quoted this, I quoted this in my book and in a few other places. And when my book first came out, it first came out in 2002, I had emails from people who had lived through communism in Eastern Europe who emailed me, who read my book, and said, well, this is how it was under communism. The only place where you could criticize the government was in the prisons, in Ceausescu's prison or wherever, whoever's prison that you were in. But that's what Dean Sprague said it was like in the North. So when you hear these really extremely harsh denunciations, this Wisconsin newspaper calling for the assassination of the president, it's horrible. But why would people say things like that? Well, this is one of the reasons. That whoever wrote that probably had his father or brother or somebody who was dragged out of his home in the middle of the night and disappeared for a couple of years, and or worse. So yeah, that's why this sort of thing happened. Also, if you read Constitutional Problems Under Lincoln by James Randall, you find out that he says about 300 opposition newspapers were shut down in the northern states. No, he didn't get every last one, and there were a few brave people like that Wisconsin newspaper editor who criticized the Lincoln administration, but James Randall documents about 300, and especially the New York papers. This is probably why the New York Times was so harsh in that quotation that I read. Because the mayor of New York at the time was a man named Fernando Wood, and he wanted New York City to secede from New York State and the Union and just trade with all the rest of the world, because New York was a big international hub of commerce. And he said, let them fight it out, the Civil War. We just want to do business with everybody. And of course, Lincoln hated that. He couldn't tolerate that. And that's one of the reasons why there were draft riots in New York City, shortly after the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. And Lincoln sent 15,000 federal troops who marched from Gettysburg to New York City and shot into the crowd. And the book on this is by a man named Ivor Bernstein. It's called the New York City Draft Riots. And he says nobody knows how many people were killed. He says about 700, but nobody really knows. It's just a guess. So federal troops literally just marched in New York City and shot into these crowds of draft protesters and killed them by the hundreds, maybe the thousands, who knows. I imagine 15,000 troops had a lot of firepower in that day. And so you can understand why New Yorkers especially would have been a little upset with the Lincoln administration. And also, some of the research I've read said that once they started enforcing the draft, it was sort of disproportionately enforced in New York as a way of punishing them for all of this. Another reason why, a man like Howard Phillips changed his thinking on Lincoln from when he was a young man to when he was an older man is the deportation of a member of Congress named Clement Vallandigham. He was a member of Congress from Ohio, who was the most outspoken Democratic Party critic of Lincoln. Now, the Democrats, in the mid-19th century, were still the party of Jefferson. They were still the party of limited government, except for the sin of slavery. A lot of the Democrats, Southern Democrats, supported slavery, as did Lincoln, as did a lot of the Republicans, as far as that goes. But to the extent that there was a movement for free trade, limited constitutional government, it was mostly the Democrats who were famous for that because of the legacy of Jefferson and Jackson and some of the others who were Democrats. And Vallandigham was firmly in that camp. If you read some of his speeches, and you didn't know who it was, it could have been Thomas Jefferson or someone of that sort philosophically. And so anyway, he was the most outspoken member of Congress. So habeas corpus having been suspended, 70 federal soldiers arrived at his home in Akron, Ohio one day and dragged him out of his house. No due process, no arrest warrant. There was no habeas corpus. And they ceremoniously turned him over to a Confederate commander in Tennessee. And the Confederates pretty much said, "What's this? Who's this guy? We don't want him." And because the Lincoln administration wanted to make the point that he's a traitor, so we're going to give him back to his people. He's from Ohio. And so he left. The Confederates said, "Get out of here." We don't. And he ended up going to Canada. So he went into exile in Canada. And so anyway, back when Hillary Clinton was in the Senate, when I give a speech like this, I would say something like, it would be as though President Bush exiled Hillary Clinton to Canada, and everybody would cheer, and a lot of people would applause. But of course, look at the precedent that it sets. Just pure tyranny. You could exile your political opponents to another country. And then the Republican Party told these big, ridiculously stupid lies about Vallandigham. They blamed him for the New York City draft riots. They said he was like the Wizard of Oz orchestrating from Canada the New York City draft riots and things like that. But that didn't really take, I don't think. Lincoln destroyed the voluntary union of the founders. Article 7 of the Constitution tells you how the Constitution is to be ratified. It's by the states. And 3 states, Virginia, New York, and Rhode Island, in their ratification documents, explicitly reserve the right to take back any powers, any delegated powers that they had delegated to this federal government, should that federal government become destructive of their rights in the future. And so, I'm not a lawyer, but I know enough about it to know that once those 3 states were accepted into the Union, that it was agreed by everyone that all the states had those rights. You can't give one state more constitutional rights than another state. And so by taking Virginia, New York, and Rhode Island into the Union with those provisions, it was understood that everybody had those provisions, that secession was totally legal and constitutional, in other words. There never would have been a constitution, in my view, had the founders thought that if they ever chose to secede at some day in the future, that the federal government would then have a right to invade their state, bomb their cities, burn them to the ground, kill their citizens by the hundreds of thousands. There would never have been a constitution of that sort. But that was Lincoln's theory. That was Lincoln's theory, that he had a constitutional right to do those things. So the union was a voluntary union, but that union was destroyed by Lincoln, who turned the union into a coerced union held together at gunpoint. And it became much more like the old Soviet Union, didn't it? Held together with gunpoint, at gunpoint, threats of violence. Even to this day, if people ask me, what if Texas seceded? What do you think they would do it? The first thing everybody thinks of is they think of the Civil War, and they think, well, they'd probably start the bombing, or so. I think they would try to financially strangle Texas first, but who knows? I have an old friend. Some of you might know my old friend Yuri Maltsev. I don't know. He's been in D.C. Anyway, he was a defector from the Soviet Union, and he worked for Mikhail Gorbachev. He was one of the guys who worked on the Gorbachev, the whole Gorbachev plan, and he defected before the fall of communism. And so I've known him for 25 years. He ended up in D.C. I think he worked for the CIA for a while, and he must have, and he probably still does as far as that goes. But anyway, I asked him how it was that all the Soviet republics were able to secede peacefully, and he said they didn't have a Lincoln, they had a Gorbachev, and Gorbachev just did not have the stomach to do what all his predecessors did. Whenever Czechoslovakia or some Hungary or any country had talk of seceding from the Soviet Empire, so he told me, thank God they didn't have a Lincoln, they had a Gorbachev that did that. One of the articles I wrote on the web on this topic is there's a well-known Civil War historian at Columbia University, Eric Foner. He wrote an article in The Nation magazine at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, opposing the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the title of it was Lincoln's Lesson. And he said it was a terrible thing that such a noble experiment was ended, and Lincoln would not have done that. And so he was praising Lincoln as someone who had been not like Gorbachev. He would have done what Lincoln did. He would not have let these Soviet republics go. And I had a good time of ridiculing Eric Foner on that one but nothing ever affects these people. I can say anything I want. Anyone can say it. They kind of like Doris Kearns Goodwin. She's an admitted plagiarist, and then she's back on TV telling us who to vote for president. 2 months later. So the argument that Lincoln saved the Union is not true. Now, also in terms of slavery, I mentioned that Lincoln never pretended that his purpose in launching an invasion of the southern states had to do with ending slavery. And even at the end of the war, I know some of you may have seen this Steven Spielberg movie that came out a year or two ago about Lincoln. Well, one of the, probably the big Lincoln expert of this generation is David Donald at Harvard University. I think he just recently retired from Harvard. And he's a Pulitzer Prize winning writer. He has a big fat biography of Lincoln called Lincoln, catchy title. And he writes about, so if you want a scholarly treatment of what Lincoln did with regard to the 13th Amendment that ended slavery, this would be a good place to look. David Donald's book on Lincoln. And what he says there is, one, he did nothing at all to change a single Democratic vote. And two, when there was a delegation of Republicans from New Jersey who came to him and asked him, they said, we think we can get three or four votes from Republicans for this 13th Amendment if you will get rid of a regulation that benefits some of the railroad corporations but somehow harms their constituents. So they wanted to play politics. And so they said, Mr. Lincoln, Mr. President, if you quit enforcing this regulation that benefits the railroad corporations but harms their constituents, I think we can get these Republicans these Democrats, right? I think I'm mixing the word, Democrats to vote for this. Lincoln refused. He turned them down. And so, the one, David Donald claims that the one instance where Lincoln was able to actually do something, get some Democrat votes for the 13th Amendment, he said no. He was, after all, a lawyer for the Illinois Central Railroad when he was nominated and elected, and he was a lawyer for all the main railroads in the Midwest. He was offered the job of general counsel of the New York Central Railroad by Erastus Corning at one point, which he turned down. And so these are the people who got him elected. And so even at the very end, when they were debating the 13th Amendment, the history tells us that he did next to nothing. Although Steven Spielberg's movie, the whole theme of it is this titanic effort that Abe Lincoln made to get the 13th Amendment passed. The whole theme of the movie. And so, and of course, it should not be expected that it's so misleading. Doris Kearns Goodwin was his advisor, was Spielberg's advisor on the movie. I wrote a 20-page review of her book, by the way, on LouRockwell.com. If anybody's interested, you can just type in my name and her name and see what I had to say about that. And so, the whole rest of the world had ended slavery peacefully. This includes all the northern states. There were slaves in New York City as late as 1853. There's a book called Slavery in New York. It was an exhibit at the New York Historical Society, which I went to a few years ago, on the history of slavery in New York. The slaves built the slave ships in New York, Boston, Providence, and Newport, Rhode Island. And it's 1853, 7 years before some of the southern states started seceding. And so, but they ended slavery peacefully, as did all the rest of the world where slavery existed in the 19th century. The British Empire, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, the Danes, the Swedes, they all found a way to end slavery peacefully, but not the Lincoln administration. Lincoln talked about some sort of compensated emancipation, but he didn't do it. He didn't get it done. Now, his defenders will say, oh, the Southerners are the most evil people in the history of the world, so maybe the British slave owners could have been bought off, but not those Southerners. But it doesn't really make sense to me that a deal, something like that, couldn't have happened, and slavery couldn't have ended peacefully here like it did everywhere else on Earth. That's another thing that almost no Americans seem to know, that this was the only place where a major war was fought that was attached to the ending of slavery. In my book, I say the one unequivocal good that came of the war was, of course, the ending of slavery, but we did it in probably the one of the worst possible ways. And then, with Reconstruction, the slaves were used as political pawns by the Republican Party for years. The white male adult population was disenfranchised in the South for a while every adult male ex-slave was signed up to vote Republican. And then after 10 years of that, the federal government just left. And they left these ex-slaves, the white population wanted vengeance. But they didn't want such vengeance 10 years earlier. And I quote in my book one of Lincoln's military officers, who was a newspaper editor in Washington, D.C. after the war, General Don Pyatt, who years after the war, he said that a lot of the racial animosity that existed in the Ku Klux Klan and all that horrible stuff was a direct result of Reconstruction, of using the ex-slaves as political pawns to raise taxes and confiscate farmland and so forth, and all these things that happened, and nothing was really reconstructed in the southern states during this time. Anyway, that was General Don Pyatt's opinion, and it sounds kind of logical to me. And so also I would argue that what we also saw was the death knell of federalism in the United States, and of the Jeffersonian interpretation of the Constitution. Now, the Jeffersonian interpretation of the Constitution is very different from the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution. In fact, another one of my books is called Hamilton's Curse, about Alexander Hamilton. And when I first started writing about this on the internet before my book came out, I had a law student from NYU who emailed me. He said, "Thanks for writing this stuff about Hamilton." He said, I'm sitting here in Nadine Strassen's constitutional law class, and we're learning all about the Hamiltonian Constitution, the Hamiltonian interpretation of the Constitution, by which he meant 150 years of case law that has been used to pretty much destroy the Constitution. And so, if you do learn about the Constitution, even in law school these days, mostly what you learn about is all this case law, much of which has been used to overthrow the Constitution. But there was a Jeffersonian Constitution. One of the elements of the Jeffersonian interpretation of the Constitution was that if the day ever came when the federal government became the sole arbiter of the limits of its own powers, then Americans would live under a tyranny, if that day ever came. And that was one of the results of the Civil War. Woodrow Wilson wrote about this very favorably in his book on the Congress. Before, he was a professor before he became president, and he wrote a book on Congress. And in the book on Congress, he praises the fact that one of the results of the Civil War was the federal government, through its own Supreme Court, became finally the sole arbiter of constitutionality. But the Jeffersonians had always warned that if you give the federal government the ability to be the sole arbiter of what is and is not constitutional, then sooner or later they'll decide everything's constitutional. Anything the government does is constitutional. And as my friend Andrew Napolitano, the judge and the Fox News Channel guy, has written in several of his books, not a single federal law was judged unconstitutional between 1937 and 1995. And so we've pretty much got you. I don't know if that's absolutely true. Maybe there's one law that made it through there, but Judge Napolitano, he's a fabulous constitutional scholar. If you doubt me, go on. I teach at the Mises University every summer, the Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama, and the judge has been one of the faculty members the last 2 years. He teaches like a 8-part series on the Constitution and the free market. And it's just spectacular. It's just he's so knowledgeable about these things. And you can go online on mises.org or send your kids to do it if you are grandkids or whatever, if they're interested in these things, and they can get a free education on the Constitution. One of the donors to the Mises Institute is a wealthy investment banker, lawyer, educated at Harvard. And she said to me that this was much better than anything she ever got at Harvard Law School. Just 8 lectures by Napolitano on that. And so I would argue that the original idea of federalism was that the people, in some way, through their political communities organized at the state and local level, had to have a powerful influence over the central government, over what is and is not the legitimate powers of the central government. And how were they to do that? Secession, the threat of secession, and nullification, and the threat of nullification. That's how they were to do that. That all ended with the Civil War. It seems to be making a minor comeback today, nullification especially, but that all ended with the Civil War. And so true federalism in the Jeffersonian tradition was ended. There's a scholar named Forrest McDonald. He's a historian. He's retired now. He wrote a book called States' Rights in the Union, and he remarked on it's sort of a irony that the idea of federalism is equated with the United States. It's our contribution to political science, but it's no longer practiced here. It's other parts of the world, Switzerland and other places, you can find true federalism, but not here. That ended with Lincoln's War. And so finally, the final thing I'll say about Lincoln and the whole topic of freedom is that Lincoln was a Hamiltonian in terms of economics. I call him the political son of Alexander Hamilton. And now what does that mean? In terms of economics, it means that for his entire career in politics, Lincoln crusaded for high protectionist tariffs on imports, for what we today would call corporate welfare. They called it internal improvements back in those days, good euphemism, and a national bank to finance it all. It was called the American System by Henry Clay. Lincoln called Henry Clay a beau ideal of a statesman. He said it was his political idol. He said, I got all my ideas about politics from Henry Clay. All of that was put into place during the Lincoln administration. There had been the decades-long battle over protectionist tariffs. We had 50% tariffs from the Civil War until the income tax came in 1913. They opened the door to the massive subsidies to railroad corporations, and so once they got theirs, everybody else wanted theirs too. And so the world we live in today, with corporate welfare run amok all started with the Civil War. And Lincoln did not succeed in resurrecting a Federal Reserve, a central bank, but he did nationalize the money supply with the National Currency Acts and the Legal Tender Acts, and the creation of the greenback dollar and the imposition of taxes on competing currencies that had existed. And so this was, economists call this mercantilism. It was sort of the corrupt, rotten economic system of England at the time of the American Revolution, the same system that Americans fought a revolution against to escape. And the Hamiltonians wanted to put this into place for decades. They finally got their way during the Lincoln administration. I tell people when I give my talk on Hamilton that if you ever saw this old movie, History of the World Part 2, where Mel Brooks plays the King of France, and his laugh line is, "It's good to be the king." He keeps saying, "It's good to be the king." You know, who would argue with that? And that's how I view the Hamiltonians in American history. They knew that if you're on the paying side of this corrupt mercantilist system, that's bad. You don't want. But if you're on the money collecting side, it's good. It's good to be the king. So as long as we're in charge, we want this. We want to run this scam. But if we're not in charge, it can be bad news for us. And so that was cemented into place also.